So thank you everyone for joining Cook Library and the Graduate Student Association for this Fall 2021 Citation Styles workshop. Let's get started.
First things first, my name is David Bauer. I'm the president of the Graduate Student Association, and I am so grateful for being able to work with the Cook Library to bring this workshop to you all. A quick word about the GSA. All graduate students at Towson University are automatically members of the Graduate Student Association. There are 6 graduate student association officers, 1 assigned to each college, and we represent um, the graduate student body at university level boards and committees and things like that. And we are there to raise up any issues that the graduate student body brings to us to those boards. We're kind of co-located right now. Our main office is in the administration building on the 3rd floor in room 301. You can always give us a phone call at 410-704-3967 or email us at gsa@towson.edu or towson.edu. But feel free to stop by and see us if you have a question. We also have a graduate student center in the psychology building on the 2nd floor in room 205. And that is open generally from about 10 a.m. to maybe 7 p.m. And it's a quiet area with computers for graduate students to just recharge, study, take care of all the things that they need to take care of during their school day. I think we'll probably be good for the next slide. Thank you. So as I mentioned earlier, the Graduate Student Association represents the graduate student body on these committees, and we also propose and help coordinate workshops that we think will be of useful information to graduate students like this one. The third thing that the Graduate Student Association does for the student body is providing funding in a variety of different ways. We have travel funding that will allow students to attend conferences, so registration and travel fees. If you are attending those conferences, we can offer up to $300 in grants, and if you're presenting, we can offer up to $600. The second is professional development, which go towards things like praxis exams, certification training, anything specifically skill intensive. So if you're looking to get a leg up as a professional, the professional development grant is a great way to do that. And it can also be applied to things like professional memberships in organizations. So, for example, the Maryland School Psychology Association, you could apply for membership using that professional development grant. And then finally, the most straightforward is research. As graduate students, we conduct research, especially those in the hard sciences, and research grants can be used to acquire materials and as well as offer participation incentives for participation in social sciences surveys. And in that, we can offer up to $600. If you want more information regarding funding, please just give us an email at gsa@towson.edu, and I'll be happy to answer any questions you might have regarding funding. Thank you.
Thanks, David. So here is a little bit about some of the folks at the library who can help you with citation questions. Of course, we're all able and eager to help you, but 2 of us on this screen are here with you today. My name is Brittany Ballard, and my pronouns are she, hers. I am the Learning Technologies librarian, and I'm also the subject specialist for educational technology and literacy. And so if you are an instructional technology graduate student, then I am your personal librarian. And my email is there on the screen. Feel free to reach out for a video consult, a phone call, direct messaging, email, whatever works best. I'm happy to work with you at a time and in a format that works for your schedule and preferences.
All right, and I'm Elizabeth White. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the Science, Technology, and Mathematics librarian at the Cook Library. So I work with, let's see, biology, chemistry, computer science, environmental science, mathematics, and all of the different programs that fall in those areas. So if you're a graduate student in almost any program in Fisher College, then I am your personal librarian, and you can reach out to me for research assistance too. And I also want to thank Lisa Sweeney, another research and instruction librarian in our department, and Jen Wodarczyk, who is a library associate, for co-teaching the in-person session with me yesterday and for helping us put all of these presentation materials together. We do want to have a quick disclaimer here. So Brittany and I are both excited about citations, but we're not experts in citation styles by any means. So we're not the individuals that created the APA manual or the MLA handbook, but we do use these styles a lot. We help students with citations all the time. We use citations in our own scholarly work. So we're very well equipped to help you interpret these guidelines, but we're not the individuals who made the rules, so to speak. And with that in mind, it's important for you to consider that you don't have to be an expert or memorize any citation styles either. The reality is, for us, I could probably cite an APA journal article without looking at the requirements, but that's about it, and only because I've used APA so much in my works. But for everything else, I'm looking at all of the resources we'll show you, just like you may be when creating citations too. So with that in mind, our goal is really to help you understand the differences between citation styles so that you can use these different resources more effectively to create your citations.
All right, and so this is where hopefully things get fun. Before we dive in and start looking at the various citation styles, we did just want to facilitate sort of a high level conversation about why we cite at all, right? Um, and so I like to think of this sort of as one theory of citation. And so we cite for each other as colleagues, as scholars. Um, and when I say scholar, I mean everyone here in higher ed, from a first year undergraduate to a tenured professor, right? We cite each other to give each other credit and to celebrate each other, to celebrate our peers, even if we never meet them, and to celebrate our ancestors, the works of those whose shoulders we are standing on, right? Who have made the field what it is, who have worked to shape and change academia and the face of publications, right? So that's one reason. Another reason is we cite for our readers. If you write, and when I say write, I mean anything from presenting to a blog to a peer-reviewed scholarly article to a podcast, right? So when we put something out there in the world, we are doing that to be interacted with. And so we want to be conscientious of the reading experience, the engagement experience that we're creating. We're entering into a community with our readers, and we want them to be able to trace information back to its original source if they want to learn more about it and to, come up with their own take on a piece of information, and then to contextualize perspective. So, for instance, um, the information we give in a citation can help our readers determine why is this important, why is someone citing this source and maybe not another one, right? Finally, and this is probably what we talk about most in academia, is we do cite for ourselves, right? So we cite to build up our own scholarly credibility. We bolster, our academic integrity by, of course, giving credit where it's due. and to support our argument, to strengthen our case, right? To develop that case and ultimately strengthen it. We linked to a really great but very long thread exploring the impact of plagiarism. That, of course, is one of the reasons we hear typically from students when we think about the answers to why we cite. It's just to avoid plagiarism. And that's important. But plagiarism does look and feel different depending upon where you are in the world, right? Citing is different in other countries than it is here in the West. And so this example of plagiarism is um, a, a BIPOC female scholar, maybe tenure track. I don't remember. It's been a little while. But a scholar with non-dominant identities, multiple non-dominant identities, whose work has not been cited in a peer-reviewed, high impact piece of scholarly writing, right? And it details the formal and informal steps she takes to try to remedy that, but ultimately fails to do so in a satisfying way. So before we move on, I do just want to pause and invite any reflections, any additional insight on maybe why we cite, or any feels that you might have in response to that story, or questions you might have moving forward to help us guide the content of our session for the time we have left. So again, feel free to unmute yourself or use the chat.
And I'll just say, as a person who experiences multiple privileges, this frustrated and angered me. It's inexcusable from a professional setting, from an academic setting. No matter how you look at it, this is gross negligence and arrogance and infuriating.
And it also makes you think about how many cases like this just go completely unreported. But this person had to really keep going back, talking to the authors. They talked to the journal at one point, and they were acting like it was her responsibility to like add in the citations to this already published work, when of course it's not. It's the burden of the author to create those proper citations. So if they hadn't done all of that, then it just would have, yeah, like it would have just stood the way that it was, and there wouldn't have been a story about it. And I'm sure that's the case for many other instances of plagiarism too. Some of it might not be discovered at all, or sometimes um, an individual just might decide it's a battle that they're not willing to fight.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. It is really sad, and it also presents the exciting opportunity for citations to be another radical action that we engage in when we think about whose voices we are citing, right? Um, and it gets very nicely into the spirit of citations, which is something that Elizabeth will talk about a little bit more here.
Yeah, so we have a few just general tips to keep in mind as you're citing anything in any style. Of course, beyond all of those wonderful reasons we have for citing, besides just it being required, when you're doing this, like, you need to keep in mind if it's a paper for a class or if it's something that you're going to publish in a journal, you need to make sure you're following whatever requirements they are giving you. So which citation style you're using, what paper formatting, other like style conventions and things like that. Always check with the person or group that you're submitting to make sure you're following their recommendations. Then once you have picked the style, that you need to use in this case. Then you need to make sure you're using it consistently and that you're continuing to use it across any technology that you're using to help with your research and writing process. So if you're going between word processors, citation management tools, or other citation generators, make sure you're keeping the same style there, and making sure that any tool you're using is also the correct edition of that style, because they do get updated. Sometimes fairly regularly, sometimes a little bit more sporadically, but that can happen too. So it's important to know both the style and the edition. And then that leads us into our last point, which is acknowledging the difference between the spirit of citation, so all of those ideas that we just discussed, and citing for a grade. Because it's very easy to get bogged down in the details, especially when you're citing alternative types of sources, so things beyond just scholarly journals that might not always have clear-cut answers in every single manual. So remember not to lose sight of why we're actually citing things, and make sure that you're providing enough information that someone, that you're able to give proper credit, and that someone else could find that source again later. So in cases where there isn't an exact match, just focus on those details, and that's going to really be the most important thing. Okay, and so on this slide, we just have an example of one source that I've gone through and cited in 4 different styles. So I don't expect you to absorb all of this information at once and suddenly know all of the details, but there are a couple things that I'd like you to note from this example. So the first is that if you scan through all of these, you'll probably notice that they're asking for the same information. It's just in a different format. So in each case, we have the authors, we have the title of the journal, we have volume, issue number, page range, digital object identifier, or DOI. That's all there. It's just the different styles have incorporated different formatting. So some things are italicized versus not, and the order of things is different. Then something else you might notice is that some of the styles use author's full name, so they've written out the first name in addition to the last name, whereas others just use the initials. So that's led to some interesting discussions with my colleagues about this, because we think part of the reason that some styles have moved away from full names is that that could potentially reduce gender and possibly racial bias as well, because you don't have as much information about that author's identity if you're just getting an initial as opposed to their full name, and any potential baggage that could come with that, or prejudices. Then another difference you may notice is that the year appears in different places in different citation styles. You see in APA, it's the second thing, because in the social sciences, they really value current information. Whereas in MLA, the year is one of the last things in the citation. And if you think of when MLA is used, mostly in the humanities, that makes a lot of sense, because with a lot of those works, it's about the piece itself and its creator, but when it was published can be kind of secondary. For example, you wouldn't decide not to cite Shakespeare just because it was written very long ago. The fact that Shakespeare wrote it and what the specific piece is far more important than when it was published in most circumstances. And then I'll get into this with the scientific styles later, but you'll notice that Vancouver looks kind of weird and different than all of the others because it has an abbreviated journal name. It's got some stuff in brackets. So there are just some different conventions that scientists have kind of added in their citation styles to further complicate matters a little bit. So why do we have so many citation styles, and why do they update things besides wanting you to buy their new manual every 10 years or however often? So we have some ideas here, but I'd be curious to hear from all of you about any reasons you can think of that different styles developed, or why individuals at one of these associations would decide to release a full update.
I hadn't really considered the argument for author initials versus full names. I thought that the reason they included the full names so that if there were essentially researchers that had similar names, sometimes, I mean, if you're in the social sciences and you're looking at the leakies, you have a question of which leaky is it. That's why they included full. But I think you brought up a really good point about kind of separating out biases by just leaving the last name and initial there. That was something I hadn't considered before.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I hadn't considered your perspective on it either. And so I am actually another E.B. White. So I don't think when you're looking at the dates on things that I'm publishing, you would ever be confused and think that I'm the person who wrote Charlotte's Web and Stuart Little. But like with a common last name like that, that could certainly contribute to some confusion. But to address that type of concern and just make research more discoverable in general, there has been a movement to get more individuals to register something called ORCID, which is basically a researcher profile where you can connect all of the research that you've published, and different databases will have their own profiles that you could import from ORCID or just manually edit as well. So if you're searching somewhere like Scopus, they really try to keep up with which authors are publishing each things, and if you notice that something you created was accidentally attributed to someone who has a similar name than you, that you can contact them and have them correct it. So I think maybe that the technology as it's evolved has allowed us to move away from having the full names there, because we have this new capability to make it easier to differentiate even if you have the same initials.
And especially thinking about digital material, hyperlinking is a good, alternative and or supplement to traditional citations, right? Because if you hyperlink to an author's page and or the source directly, then you can very quickly get even more information than is typically included in a citation, right? Um, so I think hyperlinks are an interesting newer feature to think about.
And on the previous one, could you go back one slide, Brittany? So we had digital object identifiers for all of them, but you'll note that for 3 of them, so all except for MLA, they're formatted as a URL with the HTTPS. And so that will link directly to the article. Now, if it's not open access, it may be paywalled, so you may have to search for it through the library again to get to it, but you found that landing page. Whereas MLA hasn't adopted that format yet, and they just have those numbers instead of converting it into a URL. So some of that could be that in humanities research, they haven't moved to digital as quickly as some other fields have. Of course, there is a growing digital humanities movement. So even in those disciplines, people are increasingly citing digital born digital materials. So I would expect that over time they would update their requirements there, but that could be one reason for the difference. Whereas in the social sciences and the hard sciences, so much of the scholarly conversation is now happening primarily in digital format. So it makes sense that they would make them more discoverable even in the end reference. Yeah, what do I do with all these letters and numbers, as Brittany asks. All right, so yeah, we talked about year a little bit already. Another reason that different styles could have evolved is really based on the reader's experience with the citations. So those of you that have used APA before, you're familiar with the parenthetical citation, where at the end of the sentence you have the author and the year, maybe a page or paragraph number, depending on if you're citing a direct quote, and that type of thing. But in some styles, Chicago being the most common one, they will do footnotes or endnotes instead. So you'll see a superscript number at the end of a sentence, and then that's going to map you down to that footnote or endnote that easily shows you where to find that. So some disciplines, like history, is probably the biggest user of Chicago. It makes sense for them to use that style because it interrupts the narrative a little bit less. So rather than reading a sentence and then suddenly seeing like Smith 2008, you just see that superscript number and you keep reading on. There isn't that same interruption. And of course, that can also be more beneficial for the reader too, because they can find things just a little bit more quickly than scanning a typical reference list would enable them to do. But that also relates to the development of new editions, because as we talk about Chicago a bit later on, you'll see that they actually have two styles. So they started with this notes bibliography format I've just described, but they also have created an author date format that uses the parentheses form of citation too, possibly because they want to kind of adapt to citing references in other formats and styles, and really creating something more similar to what you see in APA or MLA. And I think, yeah, we've discussed kind of the electronic versus print divide here too. And something else to note is that some styles will emphasize the date that you accessed or cited something, whereas others will not. And that really, I think, is based on the need for current information. And it, in some styles, it's also dependent on the type of source you're citing. So if it's an online journal article, sometimes you might not need that, but for websites, it's more common to require that because those can change pretty frequently.
All right, so I think now we're ready to talk a little bit about each of these styles. And so APA is used by sort of the behavioral sciences, you could say. So psychology, education, also some of the natural sciences, business, and a whole host of others, right? Um, and we have linked to the guides, the library's guides for each of these styles. So I think we have 4 slides on the various styles. So the format will be pretty similar. And then also on the left-hand side here, you'll notice this is also a hyperlink, and this will take you to that organization's style guide. So in this case, if I click the book image, I will go to the American Psychological Association's style guide, which you need to purchase to use in its entirety. Or I can click Cook Library Guide, and I'll be taken to sort of a summary, a greatest hits, if you will, of what I need to know, as the scholar, for how to cite various sources. And so this format will be duplicated on the next 3 slides as well. And I don't know that it's necessarily helpful to click each of the guides, but I do want to just show you how to get to the guides. And so here I am on the library homepage, and if I click citing sources, here I can choose whatever citation style I'm using, right? So our slide is currently corresponding to APA. And so here I would click APA, and I just want to point out when you're navigating these guides, you'll want to focus on this left-hand menu here because it's going to begin with like a summary, right? But the important thing in each of these guides is to look at the left-hand menu, identify what kind of source, we call it the source type, you are working with, and then click the corresponding page. So of course, articles is a popular one, right? And so this is going to give us each element that you need for a citation generally. And when I say element, it's something like the author, the date of publication, the title of the source that you are citing, in this case, an article, and a few other things here. And then our guides are going to give the template where each piece of information goes in the citation, as well as format. So is it italicized, for instance? And then it's going to give us some samples, right? So you have both the template and the sample, or yeah, and some examples to look at. And that is true for all of the guides, which again, Elizabeth linked to already, and it's just very easy to get to from the library homepage because all I did was click citing sources right beneath that center search bar, aka Cook One Search. So let's pop back over now to our slides. And I know that I think the most of us did have some experience using APA, which is nice because I wanted to talk about how MLA differs from APA. And I will point out that in addition to the slides visually being available for you to see, some of these slides also have speaker notes. This is one of those slides. So if you enable the speaker notes, you'll be able to see a recap of these differences there. And so the citations aren't super different. Elizabeth did a great job walking us through the previous slide, how that bibliographic citation is different, right? I want to talk a little bit about now the in-text citations. So these are also called parenthetical citations, and these are what you see as you are reading the body of a source, right? And so, whereas an APA, the in-text citation always includes an author and the publication year, an MLA, the in-text citation includes the author and the page number or equivalent identifying information. So for instance, if there's not a page number, might include the paragraph, or if it's a film, might include the, direct minutes that you're referencing, right? And one of the main reasons for that is because, as Elizabeth mentioned, MLA is, as we see here, traditionally used in the humanities. And so we are working with things like literature and anthology. So these are typically books. And so there are page numbers often. And as Elizabeth mentioned, it doesn't necessarily matter how recent something is. On the flip side, APA was primarily designed to quote scientific writing, where currency, that publication date is a little more important, right? Other differences, thinking to the end of the paper, that bibliography section, in MLA you call it works cited, in APA you title it references. But for both of those, you should only include the sources that you cite, not those that you consulted. That is different from some of the other styles, right? And technically, MLA doesn't yet require URL or DOI, although it is recommended. And so perhaps once it's required, that's when we'll see them start giving it as a link. Yeah, so that's all I have there. Now, Elizabeth will talk to us a little bit about Chicago.
Yeah, so for Chicago, I mentioned before that it's very common in history, but you'll see it used sometimes in business, in the fine arts, and some sciences use it, though for sciences, I really only see them using the author date variety. So, as I mentioned before, there are two different styles, author date and notes bibliography. Author date is very similar to APA. There are just a couple minor formatting differences, like the capitalization of article titles is different. For that one, you capitalize all the important words, so not like and, the, of, and so forth. Whereas for APA, it's just the first word and proper nouns. And it also uses different notation for your volume and issue numbers. But aside from that, things are pretty much in the same order as APA. So if you've used APA a lot before and are being asked to use Chicago now, you should find that the differences are pretty minor if you're using author date. But notes bibliography, on the other hand, has things formatted in a slightly different order, and the real big difference there is how in-text citations are handled. And there are a couple different ways of doing that too, depending on if you're asked to use footnotes versus endnotes, as well as formatting when you have multiple sources in a row or multiple citations in a row that are for the same source. So there's the ability to add a full citation the first time that you use something, and then a shortened citation, which usually includes just the author name, a shortened version of the title, and then the page number that you're citing. So those details are explained on our guides. And for Chicago, since there are two different styles that are really substantively different, we do have a separate guide for each. So if you're citing something in Chicago, make sure you verify which style you need to use. And if you're using our resources to help you, which I hope you do, make sure that you select the appropriate guide there too, because the end reference formatting is different between those two styles too. And they have an online version of the guide too that we have access to. So for Chicago in particular, if you see something that's not covered in our guide, you have access to the online version through the Cook Library. All right, then I think we can move on to a brief description of our scientific styles here. So I've listed just three main ones that I see the most in my work with students. But the reality is that there are a lot more other styles that students could encounter here too if they're trying to cite something in a scientific journal. For whatever reason, lots of individual science journals have adopted their own style that only their publications use, but they're usually fairly close to APA or one of these other styles, just with some minor change to really keep us all on our toes, I guess. So in those cases, really the most authoritative source for creating correct citations would be looking at the journal's website and their information for authors, or a page saying like preparing your manuscript. They'll outline those stylistic guidelines there. So that's what you'd need to refer to. But some journals do use styles that are used by other people too. And so the most common ones you'll see in the sciences are the American Chemical Society, or ACS, for chemistry publications, as you would expect, the Council of Science Editors, which is popular for biology, and a Vancouver style, which is used quite a bit in biology, but also in medicine. And it's the style that the National Library of Medicine uses for a lot of PubMed records. So you may have seen that one before too. So the really strange thing about these in comparison to other styles is, for a reason that I have never discovered, they abbreviate the journal titles. So instead of typing out what the thing is actually called, they use standardized abbreviations for each word in the title and use that, I guess, to save space now, since the printer paper is no longer a concern. So I can't think of a valid reason to do it that way. But for some reason that's what they've accepted in their scientific communication style. So if you ever need to find one of those, there is a tool from the Chemical Abstracts Service. It's their source index. So the acronym for it is CASSI, CASSI. So if you look up the CASSI tool, you can paste your journal name in there. If they have indexed the journal, then it will list the abbreviation there on your search results. If it's not there, there's also something called the list of title word abbreviations, or the LTWA, and then you can look up each word individually. And so the different styles format those abbreviations differently, like some use periods and some don't, but they all use those same standardized abbreviations. Yes, it very much feels like alphabet soup a lot of the time. Then another difference here is, well, I guess kind of similar to Chicago, where there are two different styles. Some of these styles give authors the option to choose which way they want to handle their in-text citation. So for some, you could choose to use parentheses, or you could choose to use superscript numbers, or some, they do a number in brackets at the end of a sentence, which works the same way as your little superscript, and then that affects how you order your references at the end. So each one would correspond to a number instead of listing them alphabetically. So we have style guides for ACS, CSE, Vancouver, also IEEE, which I didn't include on there, but if you do any research in like computer science or information technology, we have a guide for that one too. So you might encounter that sometimes.
All right. So we clearly love citations because it is already 5:55 and we will not keep anyone longer unless folks want to stick around with individual questions, but we plan to end the recording and invite folks to leave and enjoy their meal at 6. So I hope that you will check these slides because there's a lot of content that we won't be covering, but some of the things that I want to send you off with at the forefront of your mind are the upcoming citation management software workshops that we facilitate every main academic semester. So think fall and spring. And Elizabeth and I participate in those as well. And so I can help you with Zotero, and Elizabeth can help you with Mendeley. And so although we would love to see you at our next workshop, which is virtual, and happening Wednesday, February 16th at 5 p.m. You are welcome in the meantime to explore some of these asynchronous materials. So we have an introductory video, which is just like 8 minutes. All of these videos are on YouTube and have edited closed captions for what it's worth. This video is a good one to look at if you have not yet picked which citation management software you want to use. So it gives an overview of how each of these are different, right? And when you might want to pick one over the other. Of course, if you already have one in mind, then you are welcome to just dive right into the guide that we've created or the YouTube playlist. So each playlist has about 4 or 5 videos in it. And then we do have, some broad services that we wanted to highlight, including a reading room, ways to get in touch to meet with your subject specialist. So you might recall I mentioned I help instructional technology students. Elizabeth helps the science students. You can find out who your personal librarian is using this link. And here's just an overview of the kinds of things that we can help with. If you have not, if you didn't meet with librarians much during your undergrad, maybe you don't really know how an academic library is different than a public library and how we can help you throughout the research process. So this is just a very quick breakdown on that. And finally, we wanted to let David share some GSA news.
Certainly. So we have upcoming GSA workshops next month on December 8th and 9th. The time is still being worked out, but it's going to be with the International Students and Scholars Office. It's going to be specifically targeted for our international students and issues that might arise navigating their visas when they're looking for employment while at Towson, so being able to work off of campus, or after they have completed their graduation and are looking to maintain their visa and apply for a job in this country. So the first date, December 8th, will be a general information session, and the second date, December 9th, will actually be one-on-one time with immigration lawyers, so that they can take a look at their case and advise them. Just keep an eye out for the GSA biweekly newsletter. Once we have that information finalized, we'll be sending it out in the newsletter.
Great. And then the last thing is an invitation to offer some feedback on tonight's workshop via this very brief, I think like 5-question survey. There's an opportunity to share ideas for additional programming. So if there are things that you would like to know more about that you suspect other graduate students may find helpful, let us know, and we will do our best to create either a synchronous workshop or some asynchronous materials that meet that need.